Welcome to part 5. If you've seen any of the previous videos, you know that I'm talking about my personal experiences during Typhoon Yolanda in the Philippines, a Category 5 super typhoon that hit the city of Tacloban. And I'm trying to make comparisons from a personal point of view between that disaster and the COVID-19 pandemic that we're all experiencing right now. In the previous video, part 4, I talk about adopting a hunter-gatherer lifestyle in a disaster, how people suddenly become much more important, and I tell the story of how I met the firefighters in Tacloban City by tripping, falling, and hitting my face on a big slab of concrete. I should mention that the firefighters that I met there were not just from Tacloban City. During the aftermath of the typhoon, specialized teams of firefighters came from cities all over the Philippines, along with teams of volunteers to help out. In this video, part 5, I talk a little bit more in depth about the work these firefighters did, mainly body retrieval. I talk about a mysterious field of bodies that wasn't supposed to exist, and I talk about the role of international photojournalists that started to arrive in Tacloban. Finally, I tell a couple of stories about institutions in a disaster, particularly prisons and hospitals. And of course, no disaster video would be complete without a story of just how dumb I can be. Luckily, this story had a happy ending. I don't have any video clips to illustrate the stories that I'm talking about in part 5, but I did insert a lot of photographs. However, there are some bonus video clips at the end as usual. You can see the listing for that in the timestamps, and you can jump down and watch those videos if you're interested. For me, they're very interesting video clips because I went back to the shoreline communities in Tacloban, the areas that had been completely wiped out, and I wanted to see how the rebuilding process was coming along. And this struck me as really quite interesting because it seemed almost like an archaeological dig. After the typhoon hit, there was a debris field over this area, as you know, extending from 10 to as much as 20 feet deep. And the people, before they could start rebuilding, had to dig down through all the layers of this debris field, uncovering valuable items, things from their own homes and from their neighbors' homes. And they had to move all this debris out of the way. And they would finally dig all the way down to the ground, and then they would sometimes uncover the cement pad and a little bit of the foundation wall of where their house used to be. And then they would start to rebuild on that exact same spot. And of course, their houses were rebuilt with whatever material they could recover from the debris piles around them. I remember one house quite clearly where all of the exterior walls and the roof was built out of flattened refrigerators. I feel like I should mention one thing about those videos though. Compared to my videos today, you might notice that I'm not speaking at all. There are a couple of moments where people say hello to me, and I would smile at them and wave back, you know, to say hello. But this was all pre-vlogging. I didn't even know that vlogging existed. And I kind of had it in my head that since I'm shooting video, I shouldn't be talking. Somehow, me speaking into the video would ruin, you know, what I'm taking video of. So I was trying to be very careful not to speak at all. So they are kind of silent videos. I talked about how a big similarity between post-typhoon Tacloban and a lot of places around the world now during the coronavirus pandemic is that you suddenly have to think about and deal with bodies, dead bodies that are piling up. And when I went to the fire station, that became kind of a big part of my life, because the main job of the fire station at that time was to locate and collect all the dead bodies around Tacloban. And there was a system in place for identifying them, though I'm not sure how well that worked. Maybe more about that later on. But their job essentially was to every morning gather a big team of them get orders, get their orders for the day. They had big whiteboards everywhere because they had messages coming in all day from all over the city as people were reporting bodies that they were locating. People were finding bodies everywhere, and some of them they couldn't get out, but some of them, if they could get them out of the debris, they'd bring them to the side of the road, and they would get all these phone calls saying, okay, there are 10 bodies, they're located here, there's 15 bodies, they're located here, and they would get all these reports and put them all up on this master chart, and then the next day they would divide into teams, and teams would pile into these big dump trucks. And then go off into the city, and they'd have all these places they had to go to collect the bodies and then carry them to large communal cemeteries. They had dug, giant holes in the ground, and all these bodies, by the hundreds, were going into these communal grave sites and then being buried over. And that was the work that they did. And I ended up going out with them in the trucks quite a bit. That kind of became my center for Tacloban. You know, these are the people that I knew best, and I would go out every day with these guys collecting the bodies. And there really wasn't much for me to do because, you know, they had equipment, you know, they had the gloves and the things to collect the dead bodies. So I really wasn't able to, you know, pick up dead bodies and deal with them and carry them. But they kind of liked having me go with them, I think, kind of witnessing what was going on. And I brought my camera with me, and I took pictures of a lot of this activity, just thinking that maybe in the future, having documented this process would be useful in the future. So I kind of made myself the self-appointed documentarian, you know, capturing all this activity in pictures. And I suppose if I were doing YouTube at that time, which I wasn't, as I said, I wasn't shooting video, not very much video anyway, it would have been really interesting to capture a lot of that in video. And thinking back, I wish I had, but I don't think I was even capable of it, because to really do something like that, you need a lot more than I had. I mean, I pretty much had nothing. I was set up for taking pictures. I had a camera, 3 batteries maybe, and some memory cards, and that's it. So in order to shoot video and edit video and do all this kind of stuff, yeah, you need a lot more than that. You need a laptop, you need storage, you know, you'd have to have hard drives because these video files are so big. So I couldn't really record any of this in video anyway, you know, even if I wanted to. The best I could do was take pictures, and even that was really difficult because my memory cards filled up so fast and I just did not have enough memory to deal with it all. So yeah, technically I was not well suited to document this whole experience, but I did as much as I could. Another big similarity, I kind of alluded to this already, about information and news, how you really have to be leery of news. And I had a very good example of this in Tacloban. This was quite a few weeks into my stay in Tacloban post-Typhoon, and at this point some items were starting to come in from the outside world. So in fact, as I was out walking around, I came across a kind of newsstand, and they were selling newspapers, the recent ones. So I bought a newspaper, and there was an article in that newspaper I found quite interesting, basically because of the work that I was doing with the fire department. I was thinking a lot about, you know, body retrieval and you know, what happens to bodies in the water, you know, the health concern this poses. It was a very big part of life in Tacloban. And there was an article about a couple of foreigners, I guess they were foreign journalists, that had made it into Tacloban. I could talk about that side of things too. That was a really huge story that became important later on. And these journalists reported that they saw this field outside the city limits. It was just a field, had kind of a wall around it, you know, just some posts in the ground with tarp closing it off a little bit, but it was still wide open. And they went inside this field and they saw this massive field just filled with bodies. And all these bodies were inside body bags, but there they were, just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. And they reported this in their story because there was a little bit of concern, I think, for corruption in terms of the aid and the relief efforts that were going on. For example, there was all this talk about how they needed money for DNA analysis because they're collecting all these bodies and they have to, you know, get DNA samples and identify the body, and they need this equipment to do that. And hundreds of millions of dollars were pouring into the Philippines. And if you dig into this, you'll find some articles postulating that a lot of that money just kind of vanished and never really ended up in helping anyone or contributing to the relief effort. So there was this idea that, okay, here's this You're telling us you need all this money to deal with all these bodies, and yet here's this field of hundreds of bodies that have just been abandoned. There's nobody there, nothing happening, and they're just lying out in the sun, baking in the sun. What is going on? And a government official was forced to reply to this, and his reply was what you normally get from a politician. He denied everything. He says, no, there are no such fields. All the bodies are being collected for analysis. They're taking DNA samples. Once they're identified, then they are carried to a central location. Relatives are notified. This whole song and dance about how these bodies are being treated. And this field that these foreigners are talking about does not exist. It's a fabrication. Forget about it. So I'm reading this article, and then I went to the fire station that day, and I talked to the people at the fire station about this, and they told me, oh yeah, we know where that field is. And I thought, wow, interesting, okay. And they gave me instructions on how to get to the field. They said, here it is, you go there, you go there, go there, and you'll find the field that these journalists were talking about. So I went off on my own, with my camera, and I went to this field, and sure enough, there it was, just as the journalist described. My first reaction to it was typically me, and I tend to think in terms of movies and TV shows. If any of you have seen the show Community, I'm sure you know Abed, and I'm kind of like a chill version of Abed, because Abed defines everything he sees in terms of TV tropes and TV plots. And everything I see, I can't help but think of it in terms of TV and movies. So I'm approaching this area with the field, and there was a building there, and outside the building there was like a entrance road and then a ramp going up to a door leading into the building, and all around this area there were these like hospital trolleys that you would normally carry bodies on, and these were scattered around, abandoned. And then you could see, surgical gloves, dirty surgical gloves thrown on the ground, throw all around all these trolleys, other medical equipment just lying around. But the whole place was deserted. There wasn't a single person there. And it looked like a post-apocalyptic world, So I immediately thought of, Rick Grimes waking up in the hospital after the zombie apocalypse hits, and then he steps outside the hospital and it's just like a disaster zone, and there's no humans anywhere. Same thing in 28 days later, the guy wakes up from the hospital, steps outside, and it's just like abandoned ambulances and wheelchairs and body trolleys and medical equipment everywhere, and no people everywhere. And of course you get these guys wandering through these empty cities crying out, hello, hello, anybody here? And of course, once they start shouting, the zombies come and attack them. I've seen that in TV and media over and over and again. So when I saw this scene of this building, it looked exactly the same. Like there was this big operation going on to deal with this crisis, and then everyone disappeared. It was just abandoned and left there. And then I went past the building, and then there was the field. Like I said, exactly as the journalist described it. All the bodies were in body bags, and they had clearly been there a long, long time. They had been there long enough that all of the grass around it had started to grow up over the body bags. And you knew the bodies inside had reached advanced stages of decomposition. So the bag itself had kind of settled around them, you know, and then you could sort of see the outlines of bones and things like that. So you knew these bodies had been there for a long time. And I started to count them. I did this little grid pattern count that, again, I'd learned from TV, where I took that giant field and I divided it in half, and then half again, then half again. So I had a grid, and then I counted all the bodies in one of those squares, did the math, and I came up with the same figure that was in the newspaper article of about 1,400 bodies over this whole field. So it was such a crazy experience, you know, that you could stand there. In one hand, you can hold this newspaper article with a government official saying to all the world, this field does not exist. It is a lie. And you can look from that article out to the field, and there's the field. You know, the field doesn't exist, but there it is, you know, right in front of you. And that kind of gets back again to how things look different from different perspectives, you know, where you are around the world. What can you believe? You know, all you can believe is what you read, you know, and sometimes what you read is not absolutely true. And I'm not saying that this government official was deliberately lying. He might have been, but he might also have no idea that it was there. You know, he was probably in Manila or Cebu answering these questions. He didn't go to Tacloban and go look for the field himself. He just got a report from other people there who told him this field wasn't there, and he's reporting what they told him. He has no personal knowledge of it, so he says it isn't there, you know. And me, standing right there, I can tell him firmly, well, yeah, it is there, and here it is, and I took pictures of it. Not to go too crazy, but when I was standing there in the field, you know, with that newspaper article in my knapsack, you know, I thought about the novel 1984. I think there was a scene where our hero, Winston, I think his name was, and I think he was working in the Ministry of Truth, and it was his job to rewrite history to conform to the new line that the government was putting out, because they just changed history from one day to the next. But even Winston, even though it was his job to do that, he didn't really have any proof. You know, your sense of what is true and what is not true gets completely warped and completely twisted, because once he finishes altering everything, that is what all the libraries say. You know, we are at war with A. We have always been at war with country A. And then that's what everything says, and that is now the truth. And how can you ever know that it isn't the truth without physical evidence? And I think there was a scene in 1984 where, through some miscommunication, some screw up in the system, Winston ended up with two copies of the same story that completely contradicted each other. Maybe one of them said, we are at war with country A, we have always been at war with country A, and then the other one said, we are at war with country B, and we have always been at war with country B. And he was holding two pieces of paper that showed to him that everything was a lie. And that was like, flipped a switch in his head, I think. It was just you have a feeling that something is wrong, that something is not quite right, but it's a whole different thing to actually have physical proof of it. And then I think that's when his slide into rebelling against the system began. And for me, you know, I was kind of like Winston there, looking out at this field. You know, you're looking at the media, a published article saying a fact, and you can choose to say you believe that fact. You know, if you are out there in the world, in Toronto, in Paris, in Prague, wherever you are, and you're reading a newspaper article that says, you know, this field does not exist, you know, what can you do? Can you, you know, you have to believe it. It says it isn't there, you know, but it turns out it really was there. So you do have to be leery of the news that you read, especially in a disaster situation. People lie, and sometimes people just don't know. I had so many more experiences like that one, and they're not really related to the theme of this video. I mean, all I really wanted to talk about was the similarities between these two disasters. And perhaps this is a similarity, but it's not quite so direct. But I would like to talk about this a little bit more in depth, because it was so fascinating for me. It was food for thought that came out of this disaster, a lesson that I learned. It also relates to how, if you don't have personal experience of something, it's very difficult to really understand it. So you've got this disaster, this typhoon has wiped out this region of the Philippines, and my city in particular. And at some point, the foreign journalists arrive, the photojournalists, and they come in on the flights, or they manage to come in on a rented vehicle. You know, they come in and they're going to report on the story, and those stories go out into the media around the world. And if you're out there in the world, you are looking at these stories and you think that is what's going on in Tacloban, because those are the stories. You can see the video and the pictures. But that is not entirely true. I learned a lot about this sort of thing. I've never been in the world of journalism at all, so I don't know how it works. But what I saw in Tacloban was so interesting to me, and it related to my situation because I was in Tacloban taking pictures and writing. I was and talking to people. So I was kind of doing the job of a casual, you know, amateur journalist anyway. I was doing what a journalist would do, but there was nothing I could do with it. You know, my pictures were on memory cards. My words were on this like little, I said I didn't have a laptop, but I did have this crazy unique word processor. It's not a computer. All it is a keyboard, a memory chip, and an LCD screen. So it can record about 300 pages into memory. That's the maximum. And it has nothing else. There's no graphics and audio. There's no internet. There's no Windows programs. It's a very, very, very old gizmo. Actually, I'll track down a picture of it. I have so many pictures of it, and I'll stick it in now, and then you can see what it looks like. So that is what I had, and I quickly filled up 300 pages of my thoughts when I was in Tacloban during the post-typhoon world there and the rebuilding. So much went on. So I was acutely aware of the problem of taking a picture and then there's nothing to do with it, writing words and there's nothing to do with it. And all these journalists, photojournalists, they had constraints, really powerful constraints. First of all, on how long they could spend in Tacloban, and they needed to get their story out. They can get the most amazing stories, the most amazing images you can imagine, but they don't do them any good if they're just sitting on their hard drives or in their memory cards. And I have to say, as someone who had been there for a long time, I thought a lot of the things they were doing were
not exactly diplomatic. They had to get the shot. There's one moment in particular, I was out with the firefighters. I was invited, to go out with them. I was informal part of their crew, and I was in the truck as we drove around the city, and we're collecting all the dead bodies and putting them in the back. And then this Jeep or car roared to a stop, and this group of photojournalists jumped out because they saw this scene, dead bodies everywhere, carrying dead bodies into the back of this giant dump truck. And they just invaded the scene and started taking pictures. And a guy jumped onto the dump truck, and he climbed over the bodies and went to the front of the truck, climbed up onto the hood so he could get the best angle possible of the bodies and the firefighters loading the bodies. And he's there with his wide angle lens with his massive Canon or Nikon or whatever he was, and he's like taking these pictures. And then he jumps down out of the truck, and they all run back into their Jeep, and they roared off again. And I thought it was like one of the most horrible things I'd ever seen. Like, get off the truck. You had no permission climbing onto that truck. What are you doing up there? It was just not polite to do that. But again, these guys, they had to get these pictures because their editors want those pictures. They're in competition with other journalists to get the most dramatic pictures they can. And then they had to get out. Now they were done taking their pictures. They were there for one day, and then they had to find a way to get out of there, get to Cebu, where there's internet, upload those photos and videos back to the home office so they can be published as fast as possible. So with all of those constraints, with all of that going on, it has to have an effect on the story that ends up in the news. My story of several weeks of being there, a much more calm, sedate sort of situation that didn't have this crazy, horrible tragedy tone, that wasn't what showed up in the outside world. What showed up was the images these journalists captured on these like run and gun missions, And I'm not really blaming them, and not all journalists are like that, obviously. But just the way the industry works, they got to get in, get a dramatic shot, get out and upload it. And they have a very short window of time to do it because of time constraints, logistics, money, all of that kind of thing. And I just found that insight to be really quite fascinating. And I noticed a large difference between my photos, my sense of the disaster, and the photos that I saw online later after I got out to Cebu and I could get into an internet cafe and look up the news. Because these journalists, the pictures they were taking were mainly of people crying a lot. There was a lot of weeping, tragic stories of, and these stories were all real. I'm not saying they're not true, but there would be people whose entire families had died. They were the last, remaining member of their family, and they're crying because of this tragedy. And those are the pictures you see in the news, and they're real, and they represent what was going on. But I was there for 2 months. I went everywhere, and I never saw anyone crying. No one. So even in the face of this tragedy where entire families had died and the city was nearly destroyed, when I was walking around with my camera, people were smiling at me. They were waving at me. They were giving a big, if they wanted me to take their picture, they would pose with a thumbs up, just like they would always do. So I never saw a single person weeping uncontrollably. I didn't go looking for them either, but I never saw anyone like that. And yet, that is the only picture that I saw online in the international media. Another similarity between Tacloban Typhoon and the COVID-19 pandemic relates to institutions. I've seen similar stories cropping up in both situations. I'm thinking of institutions like prisons and hospitals, any public institution or government service. The situation in Tacloban was fascinating because in Tacloban there was quite a large prison, and I knew quite a bit about it because over the years that I've been wandering around the world, I've had the opportunity to visit prisons. It's kind of an interesting thing to do. There used to be even an organization out there, some kind of a volunteer group. I don't know whether it still exists, where you could get the name of foreign prisoners that are imprisoned around the world, and then you could go visit them. I think the first time I did this was in Peru a long time ago, and there was a report of, say, a Canadian in a prison in Lima, and the idea is if you're a tourist or a backpacker passing through Lima, you could go to this prison and bring your fellow Canadian some supplies. There'd actually be on this website a list of things that they might need, soap or shampoo or food or who knows whatever this person might need. And you could go to the prison, and just like you're, visiting a family member, you go to the front gate and sign up in the visitor's log, and you say, I'm here to visit, John Smith. And then they let you in, and then you meet this guy, and then you can give him your care package, and then he might even tell you, oh, can you contact my family? Can you do this? Can you take this letter? And can you bring these other items? And so you can leave the prison and go get some other things and bring them back the next day, to give to John Smith in the prison. This is something I've done a few times, and it's a fascinating thing to do. I have some stories about that as well. But I did that in Tacloban. I didn't know anyone in particular in the prison. I didn't have a name or anything, but this was all before the typhoon. I went to the prison, went to the front gate. I learned when the visiting hours were, and I just said, do you have any foreigners in the prison? I mean, are there any, best would be Canadians, of course, or Americans, Australians, Germans. Is there anyone in the prison that I could visit? And it turns out there was an elderly American man in that prison. So I went into the prison and managed to meet him. I went back there a few times because I brought him some things that he needed, soap and food and different things. And he was really into Sudoku puzzles. Is that how you say it? Sudoku? So I went off on this expedition I didn't know anything about Sudoku, but I went to the stores and I bought these big books of Sudoku puzzles, and I brought them back and gave it to him. Crazy, interesting experience. What that prison was like compared to North American prisons, for example. Really interesting, and I could talk about it for an hour, and I will control myself, and I won't. But I knew a little bit about this prison, as I said, because I'd been inside several times, and I knew what it was like. And now this typhoon hit, and it wiped out most of the city, and it also wiped out the prison. But at the same time, the staff of the prison just disappeared. There were no more guards or anything like that because they had to go home they had families they had to worry about. So the guard was like, well, I can either stand here and try to guard this prison, or I can go home and make sure my family's okay. So they went home. And the entire population of the prison just left. They just walked out of the prison. And I think there was this sense of, or they were even told, that they were allowed to go as long as afterwards they voluntarily reported back. Because, I mean, how could you even keep 2,000 men enclosed in this prison and care for them in the middle of this destruction. You couldn't. I mean, they need to be fed, you know, and there would be no food coming into the prison. So they really had no choice but to just open the gates and say, go free, and later, come back. And that kind of fits the Filipino mindset, I think, and it fit the casual nature of this prison. We're not talking about the American supermax, you know, that we all see in TV shows. This was almost like a village behind walls inside a city. It was like a thriving village full of everything else you would find in a normal village. It was like a big community on its own. The only difference was these people could not leave the community. But it was much more casual, as I said, than an American prison, so it kind of suited the circumstances that they would be allowed to leave. And of course later, as far as I know, most of the prisoners came back. There were some holdouts that didn't, and you started to see posters come up, like wanted, Wild West wanted posters of all the prisoners who did not return, and they were still wanted, and over time they were being rounded up and brought back to the prison, you know, once it opened again. And I was thinking of that because I saw stories here in Thailand about concerns in the prisons here too when the first days of the pandemic were happening, and there was a prison here in Thailand where there was like a riot or a mini riot where the prisoners were concerned for their own safety. They're all, you know, jammed into quite tight quarters. There's no social distancing possible inside a prison. And then there were rumors of, you know, the virus coming in and what's going to happen to us and we're all going to die. And there was some kind of a riot at a prison here in Thailand, and the government had to step in and start thinking about that, of course, to say, you know, we have hundreds or thousands of people in prisons. How do you deal with that in a pandemic? In a disaster of any kind, you know, you have to think about the institutions. The other big institution, of course, is the hospital. And this is something else that I didn't think about until much later, because even before the typhoon hit Tacloban, in all of my explorations of that city and the region, I never came across the hospital. I just never saw it. I guess I just never went into that neighborhood. I don't know how many hospitals there were. I just wasn't thinking about the hospitals because I never saw them. I never had a reason to visit them. And then when the typhoon hit and flattened the city, I saw all the destruction of the houses and the restaurants and the banks and the shops, all of that. But for some reason, I never thought about the hospitals. And that's interesting from the journalism point of view as well, because I know that the photojournalists, they were thinking about the hospitals. So when they hit the ground to do their reporting, one of the very first places they went was the hospitals, because they have to think about that. They have to go to the government and interview people, get comments for their articles. They have to go to the hospitals because, yeah, they're professional photojournalists. They know that when a disaster strikes, most of the action is taking place at the hospital. And I think that is also where they got a lot of their dramatic pictures of people who were in serious trouble, the people that were crying over injured or dying family members. A lot of those photos were coming from the hospital. And as I found out later on, the story of the hospitals was quite tragic, because the second the typhoon hit, power goes out, storm surge comes in, wipes out all the backup generators. So whatever power systems this hospital had was gone. And for me, it means I'm stumbling around in the dark with a candle, which is really annoying. But for a hospital, it means that all the patients at that time who were on life support, who were on ventilators, who were on IV drips that were being controlled by machinery, whatever equipment they use in hospitals, all of it shut down. And all these patients that were in critical condition, they mainly died. They all died, and there was nothing the doctors could do to save them, to save them, they needed electricity, and they didn't have any electricity. Plus, the storm surge and the floods hit their pharmacies and destroyed much of their available supplies of Band-Aids, medicines, syringes, all the gear that they would normally use to care for patients that had all been damaged by the floods. And then all these people that were out there injured, who suffered all the cuts I was talking about, who had broken legs, broken arms. Not to mention, and this always horrifies me, to be honest, all the women that were pregnant at that time and about to give birth. I mean, at any point in history, no matter what you talk about, whatever city you talk about, in that city at that point, there are pregnant women who are about to give birth. And that's hard anytime. I mean, that is something else to think about. But imagine you're in the final stage of your pregnancy and you're about to give birth, and then the city you're in is destroyed by a typhoon and the hospital has no power. Imagine that poor woman at the hospital giving birth in that situation. I can't, my imagination fails me. So you have these women coming to the hospital, you have all the people who are injured coming to the hospital, so that must be a very dramatic scene. And somehow in all of my hunter-gatherer adventures and explorations around Tacloban, I never saw the hospital and I never even thought about it. I think I thought about it briefly later on, because despite having a water filter and water purification tablets, something happened and I got sick. I mean, I got really, really sick, as I always do. I think I've got a fairly weak system. I don't know why, but I eat the wrong thing, a little bit of the wrong water, and I'm down for the count. Diarrhea, brutal diarrhea and stomach cramps, the stuff where you're curled up in a ball in so much pain and you want to die, that kind of stomach cramps. Anyone who has been backpacking around the world, you know what I'm talking about. So I was suffering from that, and I put up with it for as long as I could. I thought it would go away, I'd let it take its course, and it would not go away. It just went on and on and on, and I eventually got to the point that, this misery, I have to do something to stop it. And I thought about, okay, where do I go? Is there a hospital I could go to? So a hospital did cross my mind, but by that point, I had become aware of a setup, a little field hospital that had been set up by Doctors Without Borders. I had walked by it a couple of times, so I knew that was there. And then I went there to get treated, to see if I could see a doctor or a nurse or somebody. That would have been a great episode for my new reality show. What dumb things is Doug doing today? If I had a film crew following me. But in this case, my dumbness worked to my advantage, because I approached this field clinic of Doctors Without Borders. There it was, there's all these tents, but it wasn't exactly clear to me how you go in, And there was this big lineup of people, local people, going somewhere and kind of stretching way out and then down the street, big lineup. And I went up to this lineup thinking, okay, this must be the lineup where you wait to see a doctor. And I went there and I was talking to people in the line. I just wanted to confirm. And there were actually a lot of pregnant women in the line for some reason. And I was speaking, and with children. And I started asking people, okay, is this the lineup where we see a doctor? And for whatever reason, everyone told me no. They said, no, this isn't, no, you don't wait in this lineup, no. Whether this was the lineup only for women and children, a special lineup, I don't know, but I was given the impression that no, this lineup was not for me. So I did not get into line, and then I wandered around this complex. And again, because I'm a foreigner, and I look like I belong, I suppose, in one of these places, I kind of just went inside. You know, there was kind of an opening there to go into the complex, into these tents, and I just kind of poked my head inside, and I wandered in there where probably a local person would not have been allowed to go, but I went inside. I didn't know any difference. You know, what dumb thing will Doug do today? That's the dumb thing I did. I just walked inside, and I found myself in these giant tents filled with medical personnel, and it turns out I had basically skipped the line and just walked right into the treatment center, which of course you're not supposed to do, and I wasn't trying to do that. It's just sort of where I ended up. And then this, you know, a lovely young doctor came up to me and said, you know, can I help you? And I said, I told her my story. Yeah, I was, you know, I'm here in Tacloban. I'm from Canada, whatever. And I've got some serious stomach problems. I don't know what it is. I haven't been tested. It's not going away. You know, can you help me out? And then she just put me on a bed or an examination chair. I can't remember what happened at that point. And then she, you know, gave me a check over and took my temperature and did all the things that doctors do. And then she gave me a course of antibiotics to treat what she thought I probably had, you know, whether it was just a standard bacterial bug, whether it was dysentery, you know, which is a bit more serious. I don't really know. But anyway, she gave me a course of antibiotics, and that did fix me up eventually. So that was my adventure with, you know, the hospital institution thing. Things worked out quite well for me. I was quite lucky that, you know, Doctors Without Borders was there. And then through my own dumbness, I just kind of walked right into the treatment center, and I got to see a doctor right away. Though looking back, I think I was supposed to stand in line along with everybody else. But as I said, everyone told me no. You know, no lineup, no. Maybe they thought I was working there or something. I don't know what they thought. Maybe they were saying, oh, you're a foreigner. This lineup is not for you. There must be another lineup for foreigners. I don't know. But anyway, I ended up not waiting in line, and I got express emergency treatment. I just kind of went right to the head of the line, and I got my antibiotics.
Lalo na mo, hindi kami ang ganito dahil hindi ba makadala ng Hello, sir. Good morning.
Good morning.
Yes, Bobby Benitez. Morning, sir.
Good morning.
Talis-tisan niya ano kaya pagkakilipin.
Hello. Nagkakakalain eh. Turbilang ka na. Good morning.
Good morning.
Very good. This is Yolanda. Yolanda, Survivor Philippines.
Survivor. Get ano?
Got it. Good morning.
Hi. Morning. Hi.
Hi. Oh, sorry.
Amerikano.
Hello.
Hello.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
How are you?
How's this one?
A typhoon survivor.
Yeah.
Another house.
Picture. Your pictures.
Pictures of pictures. You go to America. You go to Kuan. Philippines. Yan.